another one bites the dust. In 1980, Queen released a song that would become the band's biggest-selling single. Driven by a bass line almost every listener can recognize before a single lyric begins. John Deacon wrote the groove after becoming fascinated by the stripped-down funk of Chic bassist Bernard Edwards. Instead of filling every measure with notes, he built the riff around carefully placed rests, muted articulations, and impeccable timing, allowing the spaces between the notes to become part of the rhythm itself. For the recording, Deacon reached for his 1975 Fender Precision bass, playing fingerstyle through a Music Man 65 amplifier. The bass tone remained remarkably dry, with only light studio processing preserving the instrument's natural warmth, punch, and definition. That understated sound left plenty of room for the rest of the band while keeping the groove firmly at the center of the mix. Although the riff changes very little throughout the song, subtle differences in touch, note length, and dynamics stop it from ever feeling mechanical. Locked tightly to Roger Taylor's kick drum, it demonstrates one of the most important lessons in bass playing. A great groove isn't built by adding more notes, but by choosing exactly the right ones. Billie Jean. The bass line in Billie Jean sounds simple, but it's one of the most carefully constructed grooves ever recorded. What most listeners don't realize is that you're not hearing a single instrument. The famous line is actually a blend of 4 layers playing together. Louis "Thunder Thumbs" Johnson's electric bass alongside 3 separate synthesizer bass tracks programmed by synthesist Anthony Marinelli and performed by Greg Gaines. Each layer fills a different frequency range, creating a sound that's bigger than any one instrument could produce. Johnson played his signature Music Man Stingray, using fingerstyle rather than slap, delivering an incredibly even attack that locks perfectly with Ndugu Chancellor's legendary drum groove. The synth layers weren't simply doubling the notes either. Some added sub-bass, others reinforced the mid-range, while another emphasized specific notes to make the groove feel like it was breathing. There's another fascinating detail. Producer Quincy Jones later claimed the bass line was heavily inspired by John Evangelos' 1981 track, State of Independence. Shift that earlier groove into a new key, tighten the rhythm, and the resemblance becomes surprisingly clear. Whether borrowed or reinvented, Billie Jean transformed the idea into one of the most recognizable bass lines ever recorded. Good Times. By 1979, Bernard Edwards had spent years chasing the perfect walking-inspired funk groove. Good Times was the moment he finally found it. According to Nile Rodgers, the breakthrough happened on the morning of the recording session after he shouted, "Walk," across the studio. Edwards picked up the idea and developed the now legendary bass line almost on the spot, creating a groove that would soon influence generations of musicians. Edwards played the part fingerstyle with an exceptionally light touch, producing a punchy, articulate tone with very little processing. The groove doesn't depend on distortion or flashy effects. Instead, its power comes from impeccable timing, subtle muting, and remarkably consistent dynamics, while Tony Thompson's kick drum locks tightly with every phrase to create one of the most celebrated rhythm sections in popular music. Recorded at Power Station Studios in New York, the session also produced one of disco's most unusual production tricks. The opening Rhodes Glissandro was reportedly re-recorded through the studio's tiled bathroom to capture its distinctive natural reverb. The bass line would later influence Queen's Another One Bites the Dust and become the musical foundation of Rapper's Delight, helping shape the sound of early commercial hip-hop. Come Together. Few Beatles recordings have sparked more gear debates than Come Together. While many engineers and Beatles historians believe Paul McCartney recorded it with his Rickenbacker 4001S, others argue it was actually his famous Hofner 501. The confusion comes from the way McCartney had modified the Rickenbacker, fitting it with flat-wound or nylon tape-wound strings and using the bridge foam mute to soften its naturally bright character. The result was a deep thudding tone that sounded remarkably similar to his Hofner, making it difficult to identify by ear even decades later. The recording process was just as fascinating. Engineer Geoff Emerick captured the band largely playing live into a 4-track tape machine, leaving very little room for endless overdubs or editing. Even the ambience is authentic. Much of the depth comes from microphone bleed between the instruments instead of artificial reverb, giving the recording its unmistakable organic character. One of the smartest parts of the bass line is how McCartney refuses to simply follow the chords. He approaches notes with chromatic passing tones, subtle slides, and perfectly timed pauses, that keep the groove moving without becoming busy. Whichever bass was used, the sustained rounded tone allows each note to breathe between Lennon's vocal phrases, making the bass feel less like accompaniment and more like a second melody quietly weaving through the song. Money. Most famous bass lines stay comfortably in 4/4. Money became legendary by doing the opposite. Roger Waters built the main riff around an unusual 7/4 time signature, forcing listeners to count 7 beats before the groove repeats. It's an odd meter, yet the groove feels so natural that many listeners never realize they're hearing one of rock's most famous examples of asymmetrical rhythm. Waters played a Fender Precision bass fitted with flat-wound strings, attacking the notes with a pick for a thick, controlled sound. Rather than relying on pedals, the tone came from the Precision's natural mid-range, helping the bass sit front and center beside the iconic tape loop made from cash registers, coins, and ripped paper. The arrangement quietly breaks its own rules. As David Gilmour's guitar solo begins, the band abandons 7/4 and shifts into a driving 4/4, making the solo feel more open before snapping back into the original meter. Even the tempo isn't fixed. Because the band recorded without a click track, the performance gradually accelerates by almost 20 beats per minute, giving the song a subtle sense of momentum that's almost impossible to fake with modern digital recording. My Generation. Before My Generation, bass players were mostly expected to stay in the background, outlining chords with simple root notes. John Entwistle ignored that rule completely. In the middle of the song, he launches into what is widely considered rock's first recorded bass solo, transforming the instrument from rhythm support into a lead voice. Although Entwistle originally planned to record the track with a Danelectro bass for its piano-like tone, he changed his mind and used a newly purchased Fender Jazz bass strung with La Bella flat-wound strings. That combination delivered the clarity needed for his rapid hammer-ons, pull-offs, and blues-inspired runs, while still sitting underneath Pete Townshend's aggressive guitar. The solo itself is built around the G minor blues scale, but it rarely sounds repetitive because Entwistle approached the bass almost like a guitarist. Instead of repeating predictable root and fifth patterns, he filled the spaces with melodic phrases that answered Roger Daltrey's vocals. His relentless search for a bigger sound also pushed bass technology forward, helping inspire roto sounds, round-wound strings, and even influencing the development of the now standard 4x12 bass cabinet, proving his impact extended far beyond the notes he played. Under Pressure. 7 notes, 1 unforgettable groove. That's all John Deacon needed to create one of the most recognizable bass lines ever recorded. The riff was born during a spontaneous jam at Mountain Studios in Montreux, Switzerland, where Queen and David Bowie were simply experimenting together. Once Deacon played it, the entire session changed direction. Bowie even stopped him to debate exactly how the pattern should be played before everyone agreed on the final version. Deacon tracked the groove on his well-worn Fender Precision bass, playing fingerstyle through a clean amp with almost no processing. The tone is surprisingly dry, allowing the attack of every note to cut through without relying on distortion, chorus, or other effects. Its power comes from timing and repetition rather than complexity. The recording process was just as unconventional. Instead of writing lyrics together, Bowie asked each singer to enter the vocal booth separately and improvise whatever came into their head. Those disconnected ideas were later assembled into the finished song. Years afterward, the bass line gained a second life when it appeared in Vanilla Ice's Ice Ice Baby, eventually leading to a copyright settlement that confirmed just how unforgettable Deacon's riff had become. Higher Ground. Stevie Wonder recorded most of Higher Ground by himself. During the sessions for Inner Visions, he stacked instrument after instrument through overdubs, performing the clavinet, drums, congas, background vocals, and even the song's famous bass part, which came from a Moog synthesizer rather than an electric bass. That approach gave the groove remarkable precision, while preserving the feel and subtle timing variations of a live performance. The heartbeat of a song is the conversation between the Moog bass and the Hohner clavinet. Neither instrument dominates the other. Instead, they interlock rhythmically, leaving tiny pockets of space that make the groove feel as though it's constantly pushing forward. It's a masterclass in arrangement rather than complexity. 16 years later, Flea faced a completely different challenge. Instead of recreating the Moog line with another synthesizer, he translated it into a Music Man Stingray, using aggressive slap technique, powerful thumb strikes, and explosive pops. Producer Michael Beinhorn pushed the recording toward a heavier rock sound, while John Frusciante layered distorted guitars over the top. The result wasn't simply a faithful cover, it became one of the defining slap bass performances in rock history. 7 Nation Army. How do you create one of history's most recognizable bass lines without ever touching a bass guitar? Jack White answered that question with a vintage K hollow body electric guitar and a Digitech whammy pedal set 1 octave down. The result was so convincing that millions of listeners still assume they're hearing a real bass. That unusual signal change shaped the entire personality of the riff. Instead of simply lowering the pitch, the octave down effect retrained much of the guitar's natural attack, giving every note a sharp, slightly gritty edge that slices through the mix. White didn't try to disguise that character, he leaned into it, proving that great tone often comes from creative problem-solving rather than expensive gear. The production became even more inventive as the song developed. After recording the famous octave-down riff, White overdubbed jangly side guitar chords before tracking the explosive solo through an electro-harmonics Big Muff Pi, placed after the whammy pedal. That pedal order produced extra sustain and a thicker wall of fuzz, while the deceptively simple bass line remained the hook that carried the entire song. Portrait of Tracy. In 1976, a 24-year-old bassist released a piece that permanently changed what musicians believed the electric bass could do. Portrait of Tracy isn't driven by grooves, flashy fills, or a backing band. Instead, Jaco Pastorius built the entire composition from natural harmonics, lightly touching the strings at precise nodal points to produce shimmering, bell-like overtones that sound closer to a harp than a bass guitar. The instrument itself was unlike anything else at the time. Pastorius had removed the frets from his 1962 Fender Jazz bass, filled the fret slots, and coated the fingerboard with epoxy resin. The modification gave the bass a smooth, singing voice and enough sustain for harmonics and slides to ring with remarkable clarity. That legendary instrument eventually became known as the Bass of Doom. The brilliance of Portrait of Tracy lies in its precision. Harmonics only sound when your fingers touch the string at exact mathematical points, leaving virtually no margin for error. Pastorius layered those fragile notes into complete chords and flowing melodies using nothing more than natural harmonics and extraordinary touch. The performance became a masterclass in touch, control, and musical imagination, proving that the electric bass could carry melody, harmony, and emotion entirely on its own. Today, it remains one of the most studied solo bass performances ever recorded.